and or the stronger the negative emissions over the long term. In order to stay within the temperature limits. And also emissions pathways consistent with the likely chance of meeting the 2-degree limit generally peak before 2020 have emissions level in 2020 around 44 gigaton CO2 equivalent, have steep emission reductions afterwards and or reach negative emissions in the longer term. And also the emissions And it turns out that the 2020 emission levels with a likely chance of staying within the 2-degree limit can be about the same as those with a medium or low chance of meeting the 1.5-degree target. However, to have a higher chance of meeting the 1.5-degree target, the emission reduction rates after 2020 would have to be much faster. Therefore, different views about feasible emission reduction rates. The highest average rates of emission reductions over the next 4 to 5 decades found in the IAM literature is around 3.5% per year. And this would imply a decarbonization rate of more than 6% per year. And historically, during 1969 to 2009, a decarbonization rate of about 1% has been seen globally. However, it is important to note that expectations about feasibility can change with future developments in technology, attitudes, and economics. And then where are we heading? The assessment shows that the emission levels of approximately 44 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2020 would be consistent with a likely chance of limiting global warming to 2 degrees. On the business as usual projection, global emission could reach 56 gigaton CO2 equivalent in 2020, leaving a gap of 12 gigaton. And if the lowest ambition pledges were implemented in a lenient fashion, emission could lower slightly to 53 gigaton CO2, and the gap could be reduced substantially by policy options being discussed in the negotiations. By countries moving to higher ambition conditional pledges, and by the negotiations adopting rules that avoid a net increase in emissions from a lenient accounting of land use, land use change, and forestry activities, and B, the use of surplus emission units. If the above policy options were to be implemented, emission could be lowered to 49 gigaton CO2 equivalent, reducing the size of the gap to 5 gigaton CO2. This is approximately equal to the annual emission, global emissions from all the world's cars, buses, and transport in 2005. But this is also almost 60% of the way forward reaching the 2-degree target. With or without a gap, the current studies indicate that steep emission reductions are needed post-2020 in order to keep our chances of limiting warming to between 2 degrees 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 2 Then what does the gap consist of? The 4 pledges cases, each with different assumptions about the future outcome of the UNFCCC negotiations, result in different gaps as follows. Case 1 is unconditional pledges, lenient rules. The gap would be reduced down to 9 gigaton CO2 equivalent, or about 3 gigaton CO2 below business as usual. And case 2 is the unconditional pledges, strict rules. The gap would be about 8 gigaton CO2, or about 4 gigaton CO2 below business as usual. And case 3, conditional pledges, lenient rules. The gap would be about 7 gigaton CO2, or about 5 gigaton below business as usual. Case 4 is conditional pledges, strict rules. The gap would be about 5 gigaton CO2. And this is about 7 gigaton CO2 lower than business as usual, and almost 6% of the way to the 2-degree levels. Although the gap would be considerably narrower than the business as usual, it would still be as large as the total greenhouse gas emissions from the European Union in 2005, or from global road transport emissions in that year. And the next few slides is coming from the IPCC report. This slide shows the impacts under 50% emissions cut by 2050, where temperatures goes beyond 2 degrees. And this is primarily showing results of IPCC force assessment report against temperature targets. For example, 1.2 billion people will face additional water stress, mainly in African countries. And this one is overall impacts will be less but not zero. Would need to address impacts irrespective of mitigation. The key message of this slide is not the percentage of reduction, which is important, but most important is peak years. More delay in peak years, higher level of impacts. That's the key message of this. So if peak of emission happen after 2015, impacts will be higher. So, which is saying we need action urgently. And the main options for reducing the gap, there are many options, and increasing ambition of country targets from those with targets, and also national emissions outperforming targets due to the policies not reflected in national targets, and international finance beyond the required to deliver the existing pledge, and also mitigation in sectors not covered by the national targets, international aviation and maritime. And essential complementary actions is addressing short-lived climate forces, for example, black carbon and tropospheric ozone and other gases such as HCFC and HFCs. So let me share with you briefly on this climate change and the Clean Air Coalition, and this short-lived the climate pollutants.